She was standing in that dining room in her black uniform and white apron, holding a water pitcher with steady hands, when they started talking about her like she wasn't there. A black woman, invisible to them, disposable, just the maid. And then Sujin turned to her with that silk-wrapped cruelty and said, "Tell us something, Naomi. Why do you always look so calm?" And Naomi looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Because I know who I am." The laughter that followed was immediate, vicious, the kind of laughter that is designed to shrink a person. Hansu shaking his head, Sujin with that bright, appalled sound like Naomi had said something impossibly absurd. The whole room laughing at a black woman standing in a uniform she had worn for 3 years inside a mansion that belonged to her husband. Her husband. Because what none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to look closely enough to see, was that underneath that uniform collar was a gold chain. And on that chain was a diamond. And on her finger, hidden from their world, was a wedding ring, placed there by the most feared man in that room who was not even present yet. Pak Chae-won, Korean Mafia boss. The man they called Yong-wang, the Dragon King. And he was on his way. They laughed at her in his house, at his wife, in the room where he sat at the head of the table and made decisions that made powerful men go quiet. They had no idea what was about to walk through that door. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are houses that breathe differently from other houses, not because of the architecture, though the architecture of the Park Estate in Beverly Hills was the kind that made people slow their cars on the street outside just to look. The white columns, the iron gate with the dragon crest at its center, the garden trimmed so precisely it looked like it had been afraid to grow otherwise. No, the house breathed differently because of what lived inside it. Not the furniture, not the art on the walls, flown in from Seoul and Milan and places that most people only see in photographs. What lived inside it was the particular silence of a family that had decided, long ago, that they were not like other families. That the rules that governed ordinary people were a kind of gravity they had learned to walk above. Naomi had learned to breathe inside that silence the way a person learns to swim in cold water, slowly, deliberately, without letting anyone see how much effort it took. She had been inside that house for 3 years. 3 years of early mornings and late evenings, of pressed uniforms and quiet footsteps on marble floors, of learning which rooms held tension before she entered them and which ones were safe. 3 years of knowing exactly which teacup Madame Park preferred, which temperature made Hansu's coffee acceptable, which flowers Sujin would reject without explanation, simply because rejecting things without explanation was one of the small powers she exercised daily to remind herself she had power at all. 3 years of knowing all of them, and being known by none of them. That was the arrangement. That was what Chae-won had asked of her, quietly, the morning after their wedding, sitting across from her in a hotel room in Seoul, with the Han River visible through the window and the ring still new on her finger. "Give me time," he had said. "Not because I am ashamed, never because of that, but because the world I come from does not understand things it hasn't been prepared for, and I will not give them the chance to hurt you before I can stand between you and them." She had looked at him for a long time before she answered. How long? He had not answered immediately, which told her everything about how complicated the answer was. "Long enough," he said finally, "but not forever. I promise you." not forever. And so Naomi had agreed, had returned to Los Angeles, had taken the position inside the household, close enough to be near him, invisible enough to be safe. She had watched him run his empire from a distance, had watched him sit at the head of tables and say very little while other men scrambled to fill the silence, had watched his family treat her the way people treat furniture, as something present and functional, and entirely without interior life. She had told herself it was temporary. On most days, she believed it. On the day that everything changed, it was a Sunday in late October, and the California light was the particular gold that only arrives in autumn, when the heat has finally conceded to something gentler. The family had gathered for what Sujin called a business lunch, which meant it was a lunch where business was conducted beneath the surface of polite conversation, the way all serious things in that family were conducted, hidden, pressurized, and moving in a direction that only some of them could see. Chae-won was not there. He had left for Tokyo 2 days earlier and was not expected back until Tuesday. Naomi moved through the rooms carrying things. Plates, glasses, a refilled water pitcher. The uniform made her seamless, part of the background, like the drapes or the baseboards, and she had learned to use that seamlessness the way you use any tool that has been handed to you, even one you did not choose. She was near the doorway of the main dining room when she heard her name. Not spoken to her, spoken about her, the way people speak about furniture when they forget the furniture can hear. Naomi.
She's been here 3 years, Sujin was saying, her voice carrying the light, crystalline quality of someone who has never once worried whether a room would receive her well. Chae-won is far too comfortable with her. It's not appropriate. Naomi did not slow her step. She had heard variations of this before. What she had not heard before, what she was not prepared for, was what came next, and neither were they. Sujin's voice cut through the dining room with the effortless cruelty of silk wrapped around a blade. "Too comfortable?" she said, glancing at Naomi as if Naomi were a misplaced object someone had forgotten to remove. "With a maid?" Han-soo gave a short, ugly laugh, the kind that came from a man who had never once had to earn his place at a table. She hears a few private conversations, and suddenly she starts imagining herself inside the family. That is the problem with staff. They watch too much. They dream too much. Naomi kept walking. She set the water pitcher down with steady hands, though inside her chest something tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. Her straight black hair, smooth and carefully pinned back, barely moved against the collar of her black uniform. The small gold chain at her throat warmed against her skin, hidden beneath the fabric, hidden like the truth she carried. She had learned long ago that wealthy people often mistook silence for weakness. That mistake had cost more people more pain than they would ever understand. "Naomi," Sujin called, stretching the name like it was something she had already decided to break. "Come here." Naomi turned slowly. The room was bright with afternoon sun, but the atmosphere had gone sour. Crystal glasses caught the light. The polished table shone like a warning. Madame Park sat at the head of it all, upright and unreadable, her face composed in that terrible way only powerful women could manage when they had spent a lifetime making emotion into a weapon. Naomi walked closer. Sujin looked her up and down, not quickly, deliberately, cruelly. She let her gaze rest on the black uniform, the apron, the modest shoes, the restrained posture, as if inspecting a stain. "I just find it amusing," Sujin said, smiling without warmth, "that you seem to forget where you stand." Naomi's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Han-soo leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "It happens," Some people get around power and start thinking they've inherited it. Naomi felt the insult hit, felt it land, felt it because it was meant to. Little did they know that the woman standing before them had already stood in front of a priest and a witness and a ring, and had said yes to the most dangerous man in the room, who was not even there to defend her yet. Sujin tilted her head. "Tell me something, Naomi. Why do you always look so calm?" Naomi looked directly at her. "Because I know who I am." A laugh broke from somewhere near the end of the table. Sujin's eyes sharpened. "Do you?" Naomi's fingers tightened at her side. She could feel the old memory rising in her, the one that had kept her alive through every humiliation in that house. The night Chewon had taken her to a private balcony high above the city, where the lights of Seoul had glittered beneath them like a field of stars spilled across the earth. He had closed the doors, turned off the overhead lights, and filled the space with nothing but candles and the low sound of a violin playing from a hidden speaker. He had taken her hand, looked at her as if no one else in the world existed, and said, "I will never love you quietly where it matters. If the world is going to learn your name, it will learn it because I said it aloud." She had held that promise like a living thing ever since. Now Sujin gave a soft, vicious smile. "If you know who you are, then say it plainly." Naomi lifted her chin. Her voice came out level, but the room felt the change in it all the same. "I am Taewon Park's wife." The silence that followed was immediate, sharp, and then broken all at once by laughter. Han-soo actually laughed into his hand. Sujin let out a bright, appalled sound as if Naomi had told the most ridiculous joke in the world. Even one of the younger relatives near the sideboard turned away, smiling despite himself. Madame Park did not laugh. Her expression did not change at all, which somehow made the moment worse. Sujin's smile widened. "His wife?" "Yes." "That is impossible." "No," Naomi said, and now her voice trembled only slightly, because the wound had finally found a place inside her where it could breathe. "It is true." Han-soo shook his head. "You hear this? The maid claims she is married to him." Naomi looked at him, and something in her eyes made his laughter falter for a fraction of a second. "I am not claiming anything. I am telling you." Sujin stood then, slowly, placing both palms on the table. "You want us to believe that Chaewon Park, the man this family has protected, built, and carried, secretly married you?" Her eyes narrowed. "A maid?" Naomi felt the word like a slap. Maid. Again and again. Maid. As if repetition could make a human being smaller. Sujin took one step closer. "He is in Tokyo." Naomi's heart gave a painful pulse. They knew he was away. Of course they knew. That was why they were daring this in the first place. "Then call him," Naomi said, though every muscle in her body knew how much courage that sentence cost her. That only made them smile harder. "Ah," Sujin whispered. "So you do understand. You cannot call him. Because if you call, he will deny you. And then what will you be?" Naomi did not answer. "You will be exactly what you are now," Han-soo said coldly. "A woman wearing hope like a costume." For the first time, Naomi's breath shuddered. She hated that they could see it, hated that they could sense the edge of her restraint. But she did not break. Not yet. Sujin leaned in, just enough for her words to sting. If he truly loved you, if this fantasy were real, he would have told us. He would have shown you. Instead, you stand here in a borrowed uniform, wearing borrowed dignity, and expect us to applaud your delusion." Naomi's eyes burned. Still she stood. Still she said nothing. She could feel the ring beneath the fabric, the proof against her skin, the secret that had protected her and imprisoned her at the same time. And then, from somewhere beyond the tall windows and the clipped hedges and the iron gate at the front of the estate, came the low, unmistakable growl of an engine turning into the driveway. Naomi turned her head before anyone else moved, because she knew that sound. And in that exact moment, while the laughter still hung in the room like poison, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. The engine cut. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives before something irreversible. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room that has suddenly understood it is standing on the edge of something it cannot take back. Even Soo-jin felt it, though she would not have admitted it. Her chin still lifted, her polished fingers still resting on the table with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her whole life performing certainty. Naomi did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing when the laughter came, and she waited with the stillness of someone who had already survived the worst part of the storm, and understood that what was coming next was not destruction, but reckoning. The front doors opened. There were no dramatic sounds, no slamming, no announcement from staff. There was only the quiet, mechanical click of a door that had been built to whisper. And then the sound of a single pair of footsteps crossing marble, with the unhurried, absolute confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to rush toward anything. The room felt him before they saw him. That was the thing about Park Jae-won that no one who had not been in his presence could fully understand from the outside. It was not the money, though the money was real and vast, and moved like water through channels that most people never saw. It was not the reputation, though the reputation preceded him into every room like weather. It was something older than both of those things. It was the particular quality of a man who had decided very early in his life exactly what he was willing to die for, and had never reconsidered that decision since. That kind of certainty had a gravity. It pulled the air differently. It made people straighten without knowing why. He appeared in the doorway of the dining room. Black matte suit, perfectly fitted. White shirt open at the collar, 2 buttons down, the way he always wore it, so that the dragon climbing his neck was visible to anyone who looked. The black and blue scales catching the afternoon light like something alive. The Patek Philippe sat at his wrist without gleaming, the way expensive things carry themselves when they have nothing to prove. His dark eyes swept the room in a single motion, and in that motion he took in everything. The expressions, the posture, the residue of laughter still sitting in the air like smoke. His gaze moved to Naomi. She was standing near the center of the room, straight-backed, chin level, in her black uniform with the white apron and her hair pinned carefully back. And the look in her eyes when they found his was not relief, though relief was underneath it. It was the look of a woman who had held something very heavy for a very long time and had not dropped it. Little did Soo-jin know, in that moment of smug and comfortable silence, little did Han-soo know that every assumption he had made about his brother's life had just walked through the front door and was currently looking at the woman they had spent the afternoon humiliating. Jae-won did not look at his family yet. He crossed the room toward Naomi slowly, and every step was a sentence. Han-soo shifted in his chair. Soo-jin's fingers, still resting on the table, pressed slightly harder against the surface without her realizing it. The younger relative near the sideboard had gone completely still. When Jae-won reached Naomi, he stopped, close enough that the formality of the room dissolved between them.
He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has chosen to protect above everything else he has built. Not with weakness, but with the kind of quiet, absolute conviction that makes all the noise around it irrelevant. He raised his left hand slowly, and in the chandelier light, the white gold wedding band on his ring finger caught the light so clearly that there was no interpretation possible. It was not a fashion choice. It was not ambiguous. It had been there since the night he put it on in Seoul, and it had been there every day since, in Tokyo boardrooms and Los Angeles meetings, and every table where powerful men had sat across from him and believed they knew everything about him. He reached out and touched the collar of her uniform with 2 fingers, gently, and folded it back just enough that the thin gold chain appeared against her skin, and with it, the small diamond pendant that had rested against her chest through 3 years of silence. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The small velvet box was black, and when he opened it, the room changed completely. The ring inside caught every available light source simultaneously, the central diamond flanked by a curved line of emeralds set into white gold, the kind of piece that is not purchased but commissioned, not chosen from a display, but designed for a specific hand, a specific finger, a specific woman whose face the jeweler had been shown in a photograph by a man who had said simply, "Make something worthy of her." Sujin's breath made a sound she could not control. Chae-won took the original band from Naomi's finger carefully and slid the new ring into its place. Then he closed his hand around her fingers for a moment, just a moment, before turning to face his family for the first time since walking in. The dining room was completely silent. Han-soo looked like a man who had just realized he had been reading a map upside down for his entire journey. Sujin stood with her palms still on the table, but the posture had changed. The performance had cracked. And beneath the crack was something she had never allowed herself to show inside that house. The plain and simple look of someone who had been wrong. Madame Park had not moved. She sat at the head of the table the way she always sat, composed and vertical. But her eyes had traveled to the ring on Naomi's finger and had not moved from it since the box opened. Chae-won's voice, when it came, was exactly as it always was. Low. Even. The kind of voice that did not need volume because it had never needed anyone's permission to be heard. "I owe my wife an apology," he said. And he said it to the room, not to Naomi, because the room was who needed to hear it. "I asked her to carry something in silence that she should never have had to carry alone. That was my failure, not hers." He paused, and in the pause the whole history of the afternoon sat exposed and ugly. "I will not be explaining my choices to anyone in this family," he continued. "What I will tell you is this. The woman standing beside me has more dignity in one moment of patience than this room has managed in an entire afternoon." Sujin opened her mouth. Chae-won looked at her, and she closed it. Han-soo looked at the table. It was Madame Park who moved first. She rose from her chair slowly, the way powerful women rise when they have finally made a decision they have been holding back, and she walked around the table with her green dress and her emerald jewelry and her 72 years of absolute authority inside this family, and she stopped in front of Naomi. Naomi held her ground. Her eyes were bright and her jaw was steady, and she did not look away. Madame Park studied her face for a long moment. And then she inclined her head, small, deliberate, unmistakable, and said in Korean what she then repeated in English so that there would be no confusion about who she was speaking to or what she meant. "Welcome to the family, daughter."
The word landed in the room like the last note of a long and difficult piece of music finally resolving into something right. Naomi felt it move through her entire body from her throat to her hands. And she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of them. But her eyes filled completely, and she let them fill because she had earned every drop. The garden was quieter than the house. That was the thing Naomi had always loved about the east side of the park estate, the part that faced away from the street and the gate and the performance of wealth that the front of the property was designed to project. Back here, there were no symmetrical hedges trimmed into statements. There were old trees that had been allowed to grow without instruction, their branches crossing overhead in a loose and imperfect canopy, and the light that came through them in the late afternoon was broken into pieces, warm and uneven, the kind of light that falls on ordinary things and makes them look like they were always meant to be seen. Chaewon had brought her here without saying where they were going. He did not need to explain. She had followed because she knew the difference between the version of him that the world received and the version that existed only in the spaces where no one was watching. In those spaces, he was quieter, not colder, but stripped of the particular weight a man carries when he is always being observed by people who are measuring him. Here, in the broken afternoon light, with the sound of the family still somewhere distant inside the house they had just left, he was simply himself, and she had always found that version of him the most remarkable. They walked without speaking for a little while. The new ring caught the light every time her hand moved, and she kept noticing it the way you notice a sound that is new in a familiar room, not unpleasantly, but with the awareness that something has shifted and the world has rearranged itself around the shift without asking permission. He stopped beneath one of the older trees, a broad canopied thing that had been there longer than the house, longer than the family's presence in this country, indifferent to dynasties and power structures in the way that only very old living things can manage. Naomi stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was entirely different from the silence inside the house. That silence had been a weapon, passed back and forth between people using it to wound. This one was something shared, something built over 3 years of mornings and evenings and small, private moments that no one else had witnessed and no one could take away. "You knew," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. His profile in the fading light was exactly as she had memorized it in the early months, before she had allowed herself to understand what was happening between them. The sharp jaw, the dark eyes that processed everything without rushing, the dragon at his throat, which had frightened her when she first saw it, and now felt as familiar as anything she had ever known. "Someone called you." "One of the staff," he said, "within the first hour." Naomi absorbed this. She looked at the garden. "And the ring was already in your pocket?" "It has been in my pocket for 11 days, he said. "I was waiting for the right moment. I had something planned. Something different." A pause that carried its own weight. "This was not what I planned." She turned to look at him fully. "Then why did you do it this way?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him find the words the same way she had watched him find words for difficult things before. Not searching exactly, but allowing them to arrive at the pace they chose. "Because I realized," he said slowly, "that I had been protecting you from my world for 3 years. And in doing that, I left you inside it without any armor." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was the one she had only ever seen in private, the one that had nothing behind it except the plain truth of what he felt. That was not protection. That was cowardice dressed in careful language. And you deserved better than that from the beginning. Naomi felt the words move through her the way honest things do when they arrive after a long time of being waited for. "I was not without armor," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I had the ring," she said. "I had the memory of that night in Seoul. I had the way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching." She paused. "I had enough. I was just tired of carrying it alone." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Not the way emotion moves through people in front of audiences, but the small, real way that it moves through a person when they hear something true that costs the speaker something to say. He reached out and took her hand. Not urgently,
Not with the performance of tenderness, but with the simple and practiced ease of a man who had been holding this particular hand in private for 3 years and intended to do so without apology for the rest of his life. "The ring I had planned," he said after a moment, "was supposed to come with a dinner, a private room, music." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. No audience. Naomi looked down at the ring on her finger, the diamond, the emeralds, the weight of it, which she was still adjusting to, still learning the way you learn any new truth that has been a long time arriving. "I think," she said, "that I prefer this." He looked at her. "Because now they know," she said. "And now I don't have to carry it underneath the uniform anymore." She looked up at him. "I don't have to hide the chain." He looked at the thin gold chain at her throat, visible now above the collar of the uniform she was still wearing, and something in his expression broke open very slightly and then resolved into something steadier and permanent. "No," he said, "you don't." Little did Sujin know, standing inside that house at that moment, recounting the afternoon to anyone who would listen, and reconstructing her composure with the desperate efficiency of a woman who had never before needed to, that the story she would tell for the rest of her life about that Sunday would not be the one she intended. It would not be a story of her brother's strange choices or his inexplicable wife. It would be the story of the afternoon she laughed at a woman, and the woman outlasted her. That is the story that would follow her. That is the one that would be repeated. Little did Hansu know that the contempt he had worn so casually in that dining room had been seen and registered and filed away by every person present, including the staff, including the younger relatives, including his own mother, and that from that afternoon forward, the authority he believed he carried in that family would be quietly, irrevocably diminished. Not through confrontation, but through the simple and merciless arithmetic of having been revealed. And Madame Park, who had not laughed, who had sat in terrible silence when she should have spoken, would spend a long time understanding the difference between those two failures. She had not been cruel, but she had been silent, and in the specific mathematics of that afternoon, silence had been its own kind of cruelty. It would take her longer than it took the others to find the words for what she owed, but she would find them, and when she did, she would deliver them to Naomi directly, without an audience, without ceremony, in the kitchen of all places, one early morning weeks later when the house was still and the coffee was on and the two of them were briefly alone. She would stand in the doorway and say only, "I should have spoken sooner." And Naomi would look at her for a long moment and say, "Yes," and that would be enough for both of them. But that was still to come. Right now, there was only the garden and the broken light and the old tree that had outlasted every dynasty that had ever stood beneath it, and two people standing in the particular peace that arrives after a long and necessary storm. Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The ring caught the last of the afternoon light and held it, the way certain things hold light, not by trapping it, but simply by being exactly what they are, exactly where they are supposed to be, at exactly the right moment. And the house behind them, with all its marble and crystal and carefully maintained performance of power, was quieter than it had ever been, because the woman it had tried to make invisible had finally been seen. And nothing, from that afternoon forward, would ever be arranged the same way again. Many women do not realize when they begin to lose themselves. It almost never happens all at once. It happens when they start explaining away signs that already hurt, when they keep trying to understand someone who only brings confusion, when they accept less than they deserve just to avoid losing someone. And little by little, they stop noticing how much they are abandoning themselves just to hold on to connections that never brought them peace. If any part of this spoke to you, I want to tell you something. This can change. I created a 30-day process to help women see sooner what once went unnoticed, regain their emotional clarity, and stop accepting confusion, mixed signals, and less than they deserve. Today, access is available at a special price, from $67 to just $9.90. More than 50 women have already joined, and many of them began to see with far greater clarity the patterns they had once completely ignored. If this is your moment, you can join now through the QR code on the screen, the link in the description, or the pinned comment. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been in a room where people looked right through you? Where they laughed at something about you they didn't fully understand? Where they mistook your silence for weakness and your patience for ignorance? Have you ever carried a truth so heavy and so private that the weight of it almost broke you? Not because the truth was shameful, but because the world wasn't ready to receive it yet. And when that truth finally came to light, when the moment of vindication arrived, did it feel like justice, or did it feel like something quieter and deeper than that? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, love, and silent strength, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.